Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. It is a gloomy Thursday late morning here in New York City, but I got to record these now because of a scheduling thing, and I never want to miss these, so it's a little bit early. Hopefully everybody had time to get their questions in, but anyway, I'm going to grab myself a coffee and jump into these questions. First up, Dave Eli wanted to follow up about last week's questions about certain games on Mr. being blurry, and it looks like somebody who had pointed that out in the comments was correct in that all the games that Dave thought were blurry were actually 30 frame per second games, which is why they don't have the smooth motion of 60 frame per second games. That's pretty interesting, and that's something that a modern gamer going back might not have picked up on, or if you're an old fart gamer like me, you don't pick up on it because it's just the way. You assume that somebody's talking about something else. So great observation for all the people that picked up on that. My thoughts on the whole, make sure to get a good component cable, still stand true though. But most importantly, I'm glad Dave got his setup working and understands how it's working, and it seems like it's still a great setup. So good luck. A few things from Darkstar7. First, to the person that asked about the Sophia, yes, it will work. I would recommend the newer Sophia 2 that has a timing fix. Some people had issues with timing on the DVI-only version of the Sophia. There was an add-on from MyTech that fixed that, but I would recommend going straight for the Sophia 2. So that's the Atari computer digital outboard, and thanks very much for clarifying that. I do wish I had a chance to test that out when I had it in my possession, but I just never got around to it, and who knows if I'll ever have the time. And Darkstar also said, as an FYI, the satiator box has katakana on it. I'm positive I'm pronouncing that wrong too. So you have the phonetic pronunciation on it. Yeah, I'm always going to get pronunciations wrong, but I'm always going to try. So there you go. Another take on the satiator. A fellow Bob would like to know if there's a resource for finding reputable modders and repair people. They're not sure where to start, but they'd rather it not be Craigslist. They have about 20 different consoles and handhelds that need to be recapped, and they're also interested in optical drive emulator and RGB mods. They are in Atlanta, in case I know anybody there. So I don't like keeping lists like that. I tried once and it absolutely backfired. Back when the site was much smaller, I had a list of trusted modders that I knew personally, and as soon as I put up a list, most of them immediately got inundated with requests, and it would be impossible for any human or even a small group of humans to keep up with all of those requests. And on top of that, there were a lot of people that were deeply offended that I didn't put them on that list, even though I didn't know who they were. So it was kind of like a weird thing. Like, I felt bad, but at the same time, I was also like, how is that my problem? So I took it down. I figure, like, there's no good is going to come of this no matter what. But I do think that there should be some kind of like Yelp for modders, if you will. The only problem at all I see with that is who is critiquing the work, outside of all the other review issues that are out there. Because one huge problem we have in the retro gaming world is somebody will sell 20 completely junk glued together consoles on eBay. And in fact, there's one notorious store that's still doing that from Canada. And all of the reviews are good because the people that bought them plug them in, it works. So they just think, okay, it was an easy transaction. I paid my money, the console showed up, or I sent my console in to be modded, everything's working, fine. And then 6 months later, it stops working. Or a year later, they go to add a different mod, and they just see wads of glue and wires and phone cables in there and stuff like that. And it's hard for everybody involved. It's hard for good modders. It's hard for up-and-comers that are trying to do their absolute best and who are honest with themselves enough to be like, yes, I'll absolutely do this mod and that mod. That one, I still need a little more practice before I would do that for cash, but we'll figure it out. And, there's a lot of good people out there. And in fact, I would say there's mostly good people, or at the very least, well-meaning people out there. And there's just it's such a challenge to vet all of these things. So the only thing I could recommend is try like forums, Facebook groups, social media of any kind where there is a retro gaming community. And, sometimes those could be a little toxic and a little rough, but if somebody could be a modder and survive that, then you could probably count on their work. So that's not at all the answer that anybody wants to hear, and it's possibly even offensive, but it's the honest truth, or at the very least, it's my personal honest opinion. So that's the best I could do for you. Sorry about that. Also, thanks very much for the kind words. It's much appreciated. Justin had a question about splitting video that I guess was sparked from my comments last week about how splitting basic composite video with something like a Y cable is very bad, whereas splitting audio with a Y cable should be fine in every scenario, or at least retro gaming related. Their question is that sometimes they'll use their N64 with one of those generic multi-console cables with both the S-video and composite lines, and they'll plug the composite video line into their CRT and the S-video into the RetroTink 2X, and then presumably would split the audio with a Y cable, which is fine. So they were wondering, what are the repercussions of outputting that at the same time? Is it just as bad as using it with a Y cable? I'm not sure if your question got doubled here or anything, but I'm pretty sure that's the full gist of it. And that's an excellent question. In your case of a Nintendo 64, it should be perfectly fine. Same with, as far as I know, PlayStation consoles, Sega Genesis, one-chip Super Nintendos or SNES Minis, which, they all share the same basic design on the board. And other consoles, it may not be. And here's the reason why. The consoles that I called out specifically, at least the models that I've worked on, all have a chip that takes RGB video in and then acts as both a distribution amp and a signal muxer. My fellow nerds are rolling their eyes for that oversimplification, but I'm just trying to make it easy to visualize. But basically, it's a chip that takes RGB and says, okay, here's the RGB signal. I'm going to isolate and provide you composite, isolate and provide you S-video, and also we'll take that original RGB signal and prepare it for use, directly into an RGB connection. And in the case of those consoles, which I'm 99% sure, but I think all models of the N64 are able to be run this way. But I don't know if earlier models of the Super Nintendo are. I don't know if all consoles are. So it's something that you would have to research specifically on each one. It's info that I'll definitely get to at some point, because that goes hand in hand with another project I've been working on that keeps getting put on hold for all the right reasons. But there's another project that kind of involves doing stuff like that as well. So I'll absolutely follow up with this. At the moment, I would say for your N64, it's totally fine. And not only fine, but a great way to do that, to do exactly what you wanted to do. And on later one-chip models or SNES Juniors, obviously if they're RGB and S-video modded, that would be a great solution as well. And same thing with Sega Genesis with composite and RGB at the same time. But I'll try to update the site on everything as soon as I get that project done, because there's just not enough hours in the day to gather all this data and stop and work on these individual ones. Sorry about that. But anyway, thank you. Welcome to being a supporter. Thanks for your support, and hopefully I answered your question well enough. Alan Ricks wants to know if I ever did any videos on fixing scratches and scuffs on CRT monitors or TVs. They recently picked up a 32-inch CRT on the side of the road, and it works great, but has some light scuffing right in the middle of the screen. I watched some applying toothpaste videos online, and that didn't work, and another suggestion I read was to put petroleum jelly in them just to hide it. I don't know about using high-grit sandpaper because I'm scared it'll look worse. That's a great question, and I would love some experts to chime in. Now, if you have a TV that has some kind of coating over the screen, that would be both a good thing and a bad thing, that you would have to remove it. They're kind of tough to remove, and if the scratch is still through that into the glass, then you would still have an issue. But the good news is, I've seen a few, like Sony PVMs, for example, that looked okay. The tube was fine. And then when you removed that coating, it looked absolutely perfect. And I guess it was just kind of worn down over the years, scuffed and scratched a little bit. I've also had a TV where, to make a very long and depressing story short, an Uber driver was trying to help and ended up scraping the screen and putting a scrape right in the middle of it. And it was the CRT that Jose and I had just finished rebuilding. I let people borrow it for an arcade tournament after that. I got it home, and a couple weeks later, the scratch was gone. So I don't know if somebody at the arcade tournament felt bad and fixed it for me. I don't know if it was just a light scratch and just being moved back and forth and being wiped down with a cotton towel helped. I have no idea. So there's got to be some way to do it on some TVs, depending how deep the scratch is. So I would really look for experts to answer that question who've had experience doing just that. And I would also double check that there's no coating on your CRT. DW623 has a question, and they want to make it known that they're asking this as someone who's never even soldered a cartridge battery or recapped a console. Anyway, they bought a Saturn from a local used game store within the last year or two, and the thing still saves internally. They've not used any backup saving. From what they understand, the Saturn needs that internal battery in order to hold on to its internal save files. So either the battery has lasted since when it was originally purchased, or more likely someone has replaced the battery since then before they traded it in. So my gut tells me the console has already had some maintenance work done on it. When buying a console secondhand like this, how could I tell if this console has already been recapped with higher quality capacitors? Okay, so there's 2 or 3 answers to your question. First, the battery in back is quite literally just open up that little cartridge door and back, and then you take like any kind of plastic tool or your fingernail if you don't cut them down to nothing like I do, and you could pop the battery out and put a new one back in. So that's not a mod. That's something absolutely anybody could do. I've never tried it with it powered on. You're supposed to do it with it powered off, but when you do it with it powered off, you lose all your saves. So you'd want to back those saves up first, then do that. But that's something that's pretty common, and it's also common for game stores to just do that. They'll buy a stack of batteries, like a bag of 100, so that they get them at super cheap and just swap all the batteries out and the stuff so their customers don't have to worry. But to actually answer your question, if somebody has done a really good job recapping the console, you probably wouldn't even be able to tell it was done. Some people replace surface mount with through-hole capacitors. I don't love doing that, but there's certainly nothing wrong with it if done right. I just like to have everything replaced with what was in there to begin with. But unless you really could notice that, hey, these are a more modern brand, or signs that experts would notice, a beginner to intermediate wouldn't. So like a couple of my consoles are fully recapped to the point where one of them, it was recapped with the exact same color and look capacitors as well. And I asked my friend who did it for me, this was years ago, I think it was Voltar actually. I was like, hey, no big deal, but did you remember to recap the console? And he goes, yeah. Like, are you sure? Because look, it's like, he was like, yeah, that's how you do it right. So you probably wouldn't even be able to notice if it was really done well, unless there's some other signs to it. So, yeah, good questions though. But basically, these things, when you're refurbishing them without any enhancements, if you just want to keep them running in their original form, which is kind of my favorite way to do things these days, at least, you really shouldn't ever notice a difference like that. MJF309 said they recently found a 2001 production year consumer-grade Sony CRT with decent enough geometry. They performed a full recap and an RGB mod. It's in relatively good shape, and they were wondering what else they should do in terms of general maintenance. Along the same lines, how long can I reasonably expect it to last given the service I've already done, assuming it is in what could be considered average condition? How long it could last is anybody's guess, but you've done a lot of great work already, so assuming there's no power surges, dirty power, gets hit by a sledgehammer, Wile E. Coyote drops an anvil on it, whatever else, it should last a very, very long time. I would assume at least another 20 years. But remember that we have TVs from, I just picked up a monitor for a friend that was from like 82 or something, and it's still working. So, maybe 40 more years, who knows, as long as you don't burn in the screen or do any damage to it. But to your first question, I don't really know if there's anything more you could do other than keep it relatively clean. When I say that, you certainly don't have to open it up and clean it twice a year like you might a PC or something like that. But, if you have cats in the house or rugs that generate lots of fuzz and stuff like that, open up the back of it and hit it with compressed air every couple of years, something like that. And just, keep clean power going to it. If you live in a very old house without the 3-prong power, you might want to get one of the power conditioners that I list on the Amazon page. It's not really a power conditioner. Renee talked about it in an old round table, but it's just one of those things where if you add it between the wall and the TV, it's just safer. I have one that's my D32 is plugged into, and then I have another one that my whole home theater is plugged into, because not everything's turned on at the same time usually, so it's more than enough support for all of that stuff. But other than that, you probably nailed just a really good CRT, and you should expect quite a long time or quite a few many years of use out of it. Bad Hombre said they work with salvaged 15.6-inch laptop monitors for projects using Raspberry Pis and also to use as portable monitors. This consists of salvaging a monitor from an old laptop and connecting it to an encoder board through a ribbon cable. These encoder boards have multiple video inputs, such as HDMI, VGA, and a single yellow composite connection. While these monitors are very cheap to make and work pretty good as an HDMI monitor, my question to you is how good would these monitors and encoder boards be used if for retro gaming? Specifically, how would composite from an SNES and VGA from a Dreamcast perform? Are there any comments you may have about using these monitors for gaming? Any help would be appreciated. So, first of all, I love that idea, by the way. Anytime I see people salvage stuff that most people would have thrown away as junk, I just absolutely commend you for doing that. There's so many things that you could do with these laptop screens, or even the laptops themselves. In the case where the screens die, you could just remove the screen and use the laptop itself as a perfectly good emulation machine that already has a keyboard and a touchpad attached if you need to access menus like that. The only question I have is, how do they process 240p? And how much lag do they add? So if you're going from a Raspberry Pi, that you're going from the HDMI out to the HDMI in, so you don't have to worry about interlaced processing or anything like that. And you could even test that with a time sleuth to see how much lag it has, and a frame or under is perfectly respectable for gaming. In fact, my OLED TV has about 2 frames on it, and it's okay. I could definitely feel it, but it's certainly good enough for most people. However, once you plug in a composite video connection, there's a few things going on. There's a conversion from composite video to the RGB standards, whether it's HDMI or VGA or whatever else. And then there's the question of, does it process 240p, the signal of old games, as if it was 480i interlaced or 240p progressive? So essentially, it's the exact same problem most flat panel TVs have. So without ever testing this, my guess would be you're going to get much better performance from HDMI than you will from composite, and it's probably not going to be something you would want to use for old consoles at all. But for VGA, you're going to have to test. And in fact, you could use a very cheap converter to go from a time sleuth to this if you'd like. Actually, I list that in the store. Oh, I think I have it right here. I list this in the Amazon store as well. There's no audio connection, but this is perfect for the time sleuth, or for other cases, use cases for stuff like this. So you could use this to connect directly from the time sleuth to the VGA input, set it to the different settings, and see what the lag is that way. And as long as the lag is low enough on both HDMI and VGA, it would be perfectly fine for Dreamcast. So just the only time you really run into an issue with stuff like this is going from 480i up, both because it's deinterlacing and does it treat all 15 kilohertz signals as 480i. Check out the Rad2X and the RetroTink Mini videos have info on that in there. But generally speaking, it sounds like an awesome project, and HDMI and VGA should be good, but I would check with a time sleuth just to be sure. Raul Garusho had a few questions, but to address the first sentence, it said, "Hey, I posted a long question and it got deleted." I'm really sorry to hear that, and I've heard a few people tell me that over the past couple of years as well, that either they'll submit a post and they'll hit send and it'll never go through, or it looks like it goes through and it's gone. And I swear I have never deleted stuff off of my Patreon page. I mean, maybe there's stuff where it's like, hey, you may have posted this in the wrong spot, would you please move it? And then I delete it after, but never anything like this, So I'm really sorry about that. I would definitely complain to Patreon if this keeps happening. I have complained to them, and they completely blew it off like they usually do. So sorry to hear that. It's really upsetting because I never want to blow anybody off like that. I always want to answer every question when necessary. But to answer the question that did get posted, it looks like you have a Sony PVM 13-inch that has the same problem that a lot of CRTs do, where when something's scrolling horizontally, it almost looks like it's a distortion, like a corner of it was curled. So the other way that I usually describe it, which I don't know if this is a better or worse way to describe it, but your CRT is a little bit curved, but it's basically supposed to be a straight piece of glass. And as things are horizontally scrolling, it kind of looks like bumps in the glass. So it's coming towards you and away from you and towards you. And that's geometry and a lot of the calibration settings. And you could go through and try to calibrate to fix it. But the problem is, if your capacitors are getting bad, it would be impossible to get that calibration right. And on top of that, you run the risk of calibrating it to bad capacitors, and then you put good capacitors back in, and now it's way off. Whereas if you had done the cap replacement, it might have been pretty close right off the bat. So it's not a problem that will ever be 100% solved. It's something that even in the most calibrated CRTs, I see it's off a little bit, but it's something that you should be able to get good enough so it doesn't drive you crazy during scrolling. But that's back to the whole, do you want to go through the trouble of replacing the capacitors, open the back, or at least shine a flashlight in. If nothing looks like it's leaking, maybe you just want to leave it alone for now. That's something that you'd have to decide. Also, is it safe to let my cat around the PVM when it's on? She loves to sleep on top when it's off and uses it to climb on other places sometimes. But I never let her sleep on it when it's hot or get much close because maybe static or something. So that's an interesting question. The number one thing with cats is cat hair. So if that's her favorite spot to sleep in, you're probably going to get a buildup of cat hair in there. So I would absolutely pop the back off, every 6 months to a year or something, and hit that with compressed air just to make sure to clean it out. I linked to a really good quality compressor that I've been using for a while. It still lasted, and I got it years ago. So that's it's expensive, but if you compare it to the cost of buying those cans of compressed air, within 2 years you've already doubled your money. So definitely keep that in mind. As far as static, I don't know, and that's a good question, because I've definitely touched the side of a CRT and got hit with just basic static electricity, but I've also hit a metal doorknob, a table, things that cats might brush against anyway, and felt a much stronger zap. So if the question is, will your cat generate too much static electricity for the monitor, I don't think so. But, I would probably keep her away when it's on just in case. And would the monitor static electricity hurt your cat? I don't know, but I also don't think it would be any more or less, presuming there's no problems with the monitor, than hitting anything else that's metal. If your cat sleeps on it, though, I would just unplug the power from the back when you're not using it, just for the heck of it. It's probably no need to do it, but, whatever. It's not going to hurt anything to do it, and it's one step closer to making sure your cat is safe. But that's a good question. Anybody that has any thoughts on that, please chime in. Me personally would just unplug the power from it, and I probably would shoo her away when it's on, but not really worry about it when it's off. Marcello Medini has a good question, but I'm going to skip to the answer to try not to confuse things, even though I sometimes do anyway. A couple of thoughts on the question. First, is it possible that a switch could damage a console by pulling improper voltage? And this is the context of a SCART switch or a component video switch. And almost never on the input side would you have to worry about that stuff. It's just kind of receiving signals. Now, of course, if lightning strikes your switch and then, the power goes up that way, of course. But generally speaking, just plugging it in should be fine unless there's some kind of major issue with it. But and I guess it's possible, but I would never really think of that as part of the issue. The other part is they have an Atari Jaguar that is having an issue and they can't figure out where the issue came from. I'm no expert in very detailed electronics design, but it is definitely my gut feeling that if the problem is with an Atari Jaguar, it's a weird problem that you'll only run into on that Jaguar. Definitely listen to the interview I did with James from RetroHQ. We talked a little bit about the problems he saw that were factory issues with the Jaguar. So that's where I would go with it. They also want to know, wanted to just confirm they're using a power supply from Console 5 and a SCART cable from Retro Access. Both of those, I trust Luke. If he sells a power supply, it's definitely not going to suck. The cables from Retro Access are always good, but I would double check them anyway. Power supplies go bad, even new ones. So if there's any chance that power supply might be the problem, especially if it's a cheaper one, as much as I hate to waste stuff, I would rather waste a cheap power supply than waste a Jaguar. So if there's any hesitation, save it as a spare throw in the garbage, whatever, and buy one of the Triad ones. That would, any of the ones that work with the original Genesis should work with the Jaguar. It would be perfect. And same thing with the retro access cable. No manufacturer of anything is perfect 100% of the time. Pop that open and make sure there isn't a short or a very careful, like a very light short or something. I just, it certainly wouldn't hurt to double check, but my gut's telling me neither of those are the problem. It's probably the Jag itself. So, if you find something weird, please let us know, because everybody always wants to hear, any kind of weird isms like this. But I have a feeling it's just the Jaguar. Focus is about to pick up a second CRT that has component video inputs like their first, and is looking to integrate that into their setup without removing anything from it. So their setup is basically a bunch of consoles being inputted to two different G-SCARTs. They're daisy chained together, and then output 1 of the G-SCART goes to a FrameMeister, and output 2 goes into an RGB to comp into the first CRT with component video inputs. So the question is how to integrate the second one without how to integrate it properly. Well, there's two things you could do. The first one, which I would not recommend, is buy an Extron crosspoint, buy all new cables or modify your existing cables, and then have a bunch of inputs to a bunch of outputs. That's probably how I would go about doing it if you had just started this journey and didn't own any other cables. But even then, dealing with custom cables is a nightmare, at least in my opinion. So in your current setup, what I would look to do is find some kind of distribution amplifier for component video. They used to be very, very expensive, or at least the good ones used to be, and you could probably find them on eBay for fairly cheap. Or in this case, you might be able to find an 8-in, 8-out Extron crosspoint that you could just use one input and use the 4 outputs. I would do whatever is the cheapest and is best for your setup as far as space goes. Because if you're in a smaller area, you're not going to want to put a giant Extron crosspoint switch, but a small little box with 1 component video input and 4 component outputs might be totally fine. I could be wrong, but I vaguely remember the brand Audio Authority having something like that. I could be wrong about that, but so yeah, I would basically just look into component video distribution amplifiers that were meant for high-end video or for distributing video through places where quality was an important factor, and do it that way. I don't think you should ever have to worry about 240p versus 480i on component video amps like that. It should just amplify it to the different channels. And there's other methods to go about doing it. You could make your own, you could use existing devices with converters, but I think overall that would probably just be the easiest thing, is to pick one of those up. And if you, for whatever reason, just don't like that solution, at least you won't have to drop so much money at the beginning, because you should be able to find those decently cheap. MTT-MCC wants to know my recommendation for the best consoleized MVS for people like them who don't have the time or knowledge to solder it themselves but care about picture quality. I'm happy to spend more to get more, but I also don't like to spend needlessly. There's a ton of potential options like the OpenMVS, the Omega, the C-Box, and something random on eBay. Well, the random eBay ones are the only ones I would never buy, because while I'm positive that there's some good ones out there, there's always more bad than good when it comes to this stuff, and especially when it comes to price as well. There's a lot of stuff out there that's $700 on eBay that's no different than buying a cheap Supergun and plugging it in the front. So it's, I would stay away from those unless you specifically knew the seller or something. But my recommendation's pretty basic in that I'm obviously a biased fan of the OpenMVS because of everything that it stands for, but I do understand that Abrams got a waiting list and it might take a while to get one. If you don't mind spending some extra money, I've always praised the Omega. I think it's a beautiful case. It's got the right motherboard in there, and the only thing that you would need to decide is what you're outputting to. If you're going to a consumer grade CRT with either composite or component, the Omega is a perfect choice, and you don't need to do anything to it at all. If you're going into an all RGB setup, especially something into a scaler like the OSSC, where you could, you could just set your timing and your calibration once, and you could have, a pixel perfect 5x scale every time you plug it in, I would go to Castlemania and pick up the replacement board. Just search RetroRGB for Omega MVS, and you'll have the links to all of that stuff. It really is a good solution, and I really had a lot more good things to say than bad. I just wanted to get all of the info out there, which is why I think many people may have thought that I just don't like it, where it's just not the case. I just think it's one of these things where, you should know all the information available to you. And when it was designed in 2011, the focus of that was much different than your average focus would be today, simply because the RGB stuff we have today, it didn't exist then. So it's a great product. And if your focus is still plugging it into consumer grade CRTs, nothing wrong with a board that's built in. It's only if you're going full RGB that I would go that way. The C-Box, I've heard mixed things. I've heard the newer ones have the proper sync output. I've heard people really praise the controller adapter in it, but there's so many out there. I don't know where you're getting it from. Is one a rebrand? Is one store better than the other? So respectfully, I just don't trust them. And maybe I'm wrong to say that. I'm never ashamed when I'm wrong. I always admit it when I actually am wrong, but I just don't have enough confidence in it because it's been such a wide variety of outputs from those things. So I don't know. If you want a really beautiful case, I would definitely stick with the Omega or the Open MVS. If you don't really care about looks, I would get something like the Minigun and pick any Neo Geo motherboard. MV1B, MV1C are usually the ones people stick with, but there's definitely others, and just use that and not have to worry about it at all. You do get some advantages going with the Open MVS and with the Omega with the replacement board, though. Most notably the audio filtering, and you're getting a tuned RGB video signal, which you wouldn't get stereo audio using just a supergun, and the video output would be excellent with a good supergun, but it might not be tuned exactly to what's expected for the Omega or for the MV1C. Might be a hair too dark, might be a hair too bright, but it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, as long as it's a good supergun, of course. So yeah, those are the best tips I could give. I'm obviously biased to the Open MVS, but I do always love the Omega, and I think it's a great choice as well. Bamboo Shadow heard that the Action Replay Daytel SD Media Launcher seems to be going end of life. They always found this a very nice and easy, or maybe even the easiest solution to boot Homebrew on a GameCube. Do I know if there's going to be a somewhat adequate replacement product? I was never a big fan of the Wind Waker exploit or any of the mods. For simple gamers without modding skills, this was always my go-to solution because it's simple and just works. I agree. I hope that there's other solutions. I've reached out to some people hoping to possibly make another solution, but the ideal perfect thing would be exactly as you said, a disc that you could just put into a GameCube, have an SD reader, which the readers themselves are still widely available and very, very cheap. It's just something that plugs into the memory card slot, you plug an SD card into it, that's it. But getting a way to boot into that is the issue. And even just a disk that looks for the Swiss file, the main Swiss file is all that's really needed. But I don't know of anything, and I hope that there will be. So in the short term, if you're looking to use disks to do that, I would use any of the exploits that you see out there. I don't know if I'd spend the money on some of these games, because some of the games with the exploits are getting more pricey. But if you already own the game, that seems like a pretty decent solution. Also, the GC loader. The only thing that you need to install that is a couple of screwdrivers, the one that opens Nintendo consoles and a Phillips head, and that's it. So if you've turned a screwdriver and have a little bit of patience, because there's like 10 million screws in that thing, that's all you need. You don't have to worry about anything. You just unbolt everything, carefully remove it, carefully plug the new thing in, and you're done. And you could boot all the homebrew that way. I do really wish there was a way to keep the original disc and have something like the GC loader, but the closest thing to that would be what you said, boot from some kind of SD boot disk and go from there. So I don't know, that's my suggestions for now, but I hope that there's other creative solutions coming. Jonathan Levine had an interesting question. I'm not a game dev, but I do have kind of an opinion on this, so let's go for it. Let's say a game developer wants to make their pixel art game, either PC or modern console release, CRT and downscaler friendly. What type of display options implemented in-game would ensure a maximum of compatibility for this? I mean for ease of use, but also to get proper 4x3 240p non-squished or non-letterboxed image. Now, I'm not a game developer, so I can't attest to any of the graphics design or any of the programming, but I can, as a user, say that anytime I've ever been able to run software in 640 by 480, 480p, essentially, in 4:3 aspect ratio, downscaling worked totally fine. Some methods are better than others, some games look better than others, but that's just the basics. If the game looks fine, played in 480p, essentially 480p, 4:3 aspect ratio, then it would be okay in a downscaler. Perfect example of this is AM2R. That's how I played it last time, was downscaled, and it looked totally fine. So that's that's a pretty good generic gauge for that. And the follow-up question is GBS control currently the cheapest and simplest way to downscale modern games to 240p, or are there other good options? The downscaling video is coming. It's a little different than I originally planned. I thought it was going to be out yet, but more info on that soon. But to skip to the end, GBS control's currently the cheapest, because even if you buy one pre-made, it's still around 100, give or take, depending what models or options you want. But the easiest is still the Extron Super Emotion, just because there's no setup. You plug it in, you hit the dip switches, and then you never touch them again. But those are getting ridiculously expensive, so I would absolutely recommend taking the time to get a GBS, mod it if you could, buy a pre-modded if you can't, and then connect your phone to it and just use it that way. And it should remember its last mode, I think. So if you set it to downscale 480p to 240p, as long as every time you turn it on, it's got a 480p signal going to it, it should only need to be set once, but it's worth learning. The GBS control project has so many different things involved in it that make it awesome that I think it's absolutely worth learning taking the time to learn how to use the interface. And I do think that's my number one recommendation for a downscaler, at least for now. The OSSC Pro is claiming to have downscaling capabilities, and there's a few other projects out there as well. But for now, yes, I would say GBS control, if you don't already own a Super Emotion, is the way to go. If you do already own it, I would just use that and know that it's a great solution, and both are very low lag. Adam Ant has a Neo Geo MV1C motherboard, and they have a couple of different components they're looking to use with it, but respectfully, I don't know if this is the right combination of stuff. But please allow me a moment to explain here. So they have a Genesis 2 Rad2X, a Shogun Supergun, and an Omega MVS replacement board. And those three don't really go together at all. So I think the first question you need to answer for yourself is, what is the end goal? Are you looking to wire all of this into a permanent box that you treat as a console, and that's your Neo Geo? Or are you looking for this as a solution that doesn't have to be in a box, it just works, or specifically you want to use with multiple motherboards? And if that's the case, if you're not looking to consoleize it, then just using the Shogun is all you need to do. Now, the Genesis 2 Rad2X doesn't plug into that, so I would actually say if that were your scenario, I would sell those off and then get just a Rad2 or the RetroTink 2X SCART or OSSC or something like that, and either a SCART cable or maybe even the SCART coupler if that fits your setup, whatever's easiest for you. And I believe that the Shogun even supports stereo audio. I could be wrong. I could be remembering it wrong. I'm sorry, I haven't researched it since it came out, but I think you might be able to still do the stereo mod and route it through the Shogun and not have to worry about anything else. So that's an easy solution right there. You should be able to sell the Rad2X and the Omega board and use that to buy something else. But if your goal is to consoleize it, you won't need the Shogun at all. So you should sell that one or keep it for use with the other other Neo Geo motherboards. And you could probably wire in the Omega board and the Genesis 2 Rad2X together, as well as have all of that stuff working, or just use the Rad2X plugged into it. But then you would need a way to break everything out to that board. So that was a plug and play board designed for, the Omega. So if that's your situation, if you wanted to keep it because you already bought it and you don't want to deal with selling it, totally understandable. Maybe look into the Open MVS and just don't make the rear board and make your own custom cable that goes from the front board to the rear board. And all of these things would be a lot more work, but if you're willing to do all of this stuff, those are all your choices. But I would kind of step back for a minute and figure out your end goal and probably come to terms with the fact that you're going to have to sell at least one of these things in order to really implement it right. If you wanted to, you could wire them all together, but that's kind of like putting a second engine in a car. It doesn't really work that well, and there's way better ways to go about doing it. So once again, I'm not trying to insult you or take away from your project. I just would kind of recenter yourself and figure out what's the best way to go about doing it based on what your end goal is. DBB72 said they have a capture card that accepts RGB, but only RGSB, sync on green, and not RGBS. However, with their current setup, all their consoles are outputting RGBS. I was wondering if there are any good devices or methods that would allow you to convert it. I would definitely pick up an Extron RGB interface, the 192, the 580Xi, the 201 or 203. You could find some of those models still really cheap, and that's exactly what you said. You put in RGBS, you flip the dip switches, and you can get out sync on green. I would double check the models for all of these. I think almost all of them do it, but maybe some do and some don't. So just double check the model, but you could find them on eBay for super, super cheap, especially if you find ones without a power supply, and then you could just wire up your own for, a $5 power supply or something. But, or buy them complete and all that stuff too. You don't have to mod your own if you don't want to, but that would definitely be the solution I suggest. And it's basically plug and play. You would just have to make sure to find a way to get your current setup into the front VGA port, and then it'll come out the back as BNC, but you could change that to RCA or whatever else that you want. So that's luckily a fairly easy one, as long as you have the ability to make your own or buy cables that convert the input and output connectors, not the signals, and then let the little Extron RGB interface convert the sync for you. Well, that's it for this time. If you're new to these Q&As, please post any question you have wherever the latest Q&A post is, wherever it is that you support. The way these services work, I can't really go back and filter which questions have been asked or not, so I just kind of go to the newest Q&A post and read through all the questions there, and just do that on any service. This week, the only questions were on Patreon, but anybody who supports could feel free to ask whatever they want. So thank you all so much for your support. It's what's keeping all of these videos, the behind-the-scenes research, the weekly podcast, and the website going. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next week.